The Young and the Restless, spoilers full episodes, next week March 30 to April 3. At the Abbott Mansion, the atmosphere felt heavier than it had in years, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of betrayal, confusion, and a truth that refused to settle into something clear and Kyle stood across from Jack, searching his father's face not just for answers but for something deeper, some trace of the man he had always believed in. What troubled him most was not just the act itself, but the idea that Jack, of all people, could become entangled in something so reckless, so damaging, and so completely out of character. Yet Jack's insistence never wavered. He clung to his version of events with a quiet desperation, repeating that he had been drugged, that his judgment had been stripped from him, that what had happened with Patty was not a choice, but a violation of his control, his dignity, everything he stood for. There was a flicker of something raw in Jack's eyes, anger yes, but also humiliation. It was not the anger of a man caught in wrongdoing, but the rage of someone who believed he had been set up, manipulated, and ultimately humiliated in a way that cut deeper than any business rivalry ever could. And in that anger, one name kept surfacing with a cold, undeniable gravity: Victor. Jack did not just suspect him, he was convinced that Victor was behind it, that this was another calculated move in a long, bitter war between two men who had spent decades trying to outmaneuver each other. This time, however, the battlefield was not corporate power or social influence, but something far more personal, far more destructive. Kyle struggled to reconcile the father he knew with the situation unfolding in front of him. Logic told him to question everything, to consider the possibility that Jack might be rationalizing a mistake he could not bear to own. But instinct, loyal, stubborn, and deeply rooted, pushed him in the opposite direction. He chose to believe Jack not blindly, but because the alternative felt like a betrayal of everything their relationship had been built on. And yet, even as he stood there offering support, Kyle could not ignore the looming shadow hanging over them both: Diane. Jack's concern for his marriage was palpable, even when he tried to mask it with determination and anger. There was a quiet fear beneath his words, a recognition that no matter how strongly he defended himself, Diane might not see it that way. Trust, once fractured, did not simply repair itself with explanations, and in Diane's case, her history, her insecurities, and her complicated past with both Jack and others made the situation even more volatile. Kyle, sensing this, tried to be the voice of hope, urging his father not to give up, insisting that Diane would come around, that she would see the truth if Jack remained steady and honest. It was a fragile optimism, but it was all they had to hold on to. Meanwhile, at the GCAC, the mood shifted in a different direction entirely, one of sharp tension masked by social decorum and carefully maintained appearances. Diane's presence at the club was not accidental. It was an attempt to regain control, to steady herself in a world that suddenly felt unstable. Yet, her attempt at composure was short-lived, when Patty appeared like a storm that refused to be ignored. Patty's energy was unsettling from the moment she approached her confidence, bordering on something more chaotic, more unpredictable. There was a gleam in her eyes that suggested she was not just recounting events, but reliving them with a twisted sense of satisfaction. She spoke of her night with Jack, not with shame or hesitation, but with a kind of triumphant pride, as if she had claimed something that had always been just out of reach. To Patty, this was not a scandal, it was a victory. Diane's initial reaction was one of controlled disbelief, her posture rigid, her expression carefully restrained. But as Patty continued, the implications became impossible to ignore. Patty assumed Diane's presence at the club was because of her interpreting it as a sign that Diane was shaken, threatened, perhaps even defeated. That assumption alone revealed the distorted lens through which Patty viewed the situation, turning Diane into a rival in a narrative that existed largely within Patty's own mind. When Patty hinted that she intended to return to Jack's bed, the atmosphere shifted sharply. It was no longer just an uncomfortable encounter, it became a confrontation charged with emotional volatility. Patty dismissed any suggestion that Jack had been drugged, brushing it off as an excuse, a convenient lie meant to erase what had happened. In doing so, she not only undermined Jack's defense, but also forced Diane into a position where she had to choose what to believe without certainty, without clarity. Diane's response was immediate and cutting. She rejected Patty's version of events, outright labeling her as unstable, delusional, and disconnected from reality. It was not just an insult, it was a defense mechanism, a way to push back against a narrative that threatened to unravel everything Diane had tried to rebuild. Yet beneath her sharp words there was something else: fear. Not fear of Patty herself, but fear of the possibility that the truth might be more complicated than she wanted to admit. The confrontation between them was not simply about Jack. It was about control, perception, and the fragile boundaries between truth and illusion. Patty, fueled by her own version of reality, seemed almost untouchable in her conviction. Diane, grounded but shaken, fought to maintain her sense of order, her belief in what was real and what was not. And somewhere between those two opposing forces lay the truth, uncertain, obscured, and dangerously powerful. As the tension continued to build, the ripple effects of the situation began to extend beyond the individuals directly involved. Jack's determination to take revenge on Victor hinted at a conflict that could escalate far beyond personal grievances, potentially reigniting a war that would draw others into its orbit. Kyle's role as both son and mediator placed him in an increasingly difficult position, forced to balance loyalty with reason, hope with doubt. Diane, meanwhile, stood at a crossroads. Whether she chose to believe Jack or allow Patty's words to take root would shape not only her marriage but her sense of self. Trust once broken demanded more than explanations. It required a willingness to believe in something that could not be proven. And in a world where manipulation, deception, and long-standing rivalries were the norm, that kind of belief was perhaps the most difficult choice of all. There was an undeniable sense that this was only the beginning, that beneath the surface of this scandal lay deeper motives, hidden agendas, and unresolved tensions waiting to erupt. The question was not just who was telling the truth, but who stood to gain from the chaos and how far they were willing to go to ensure their version of events prevailed. Jack arrived at Newman Ranch carrying the kind of rage that had long since burned past pride and hardened into something more dangerous. It was not the loud, reckless anger of a man acting on impulse, but the cold fury of someone whose humiliation had become unbearable. By the time he stepped into Victor's orbit, he was no longer interested in civility appearances or the rituals of old rivalries. His face alone told the story. There was no restraint left in him, no patience for games, and certainly no desire to pretend that what had happened could be brushed aside as another ugly misunderstanding in Genoa City's endless cycle of betrayal. Jack stood before Victor with the raw honesty of a man who had reached his limit and admitted that he no longer knew whether he wanted to punch Victor or wrap his hands around his throat. It was not an empty threat. It was the confession of a man who felt stripped of control, dignity, and peace all at once. Victor, as expected, met that storm with calculated calm. At first he wore the mask he had perfected over decades, the expression of a man too seasoned, too powerful, too untouchable to be rattled by anyone else's outrage. He acted as though Jack's anger was merely another tiresome performance, one more Abbott tantrum thrown in the direction of the Newman Empire. But Jack was in no mood to be manipulated by silence, evasion, or that familiar smug distance Victor used whenever he wanted to make another person feel irrational. Jack made it plain that this was not just about him, it was about Diane. It was about the damage being done to his marriage, to the fragile trust he had been trying to protect, to the woman who had already endured more judgment and suspicion than most people could survive. Diane did not deserve to be dragged into a setup, a scandal, or a psychological war that had been engineered to wound Jack where he was weakest. In Jack's eyes, this was not strategy, it was cruelty. And he wanted Victor to understand that there would be a price for it. Victor's response, however, only deepened the bitterness in the room. Instead of retreating or even offering a hint of remorse, he challenged Jack with the same arrogant steel that had defined their war for years. He refused to yield, refused to explain, refused to acknowledge the human wreckage left behind whenever he decided another lesson needed to be taught. That refusal was almost worse than an admission. It told Jack that whether Victor had orchestrated every detail or merely enjoyed the outcome, he felt no obligation to answer for the suffering that followed. The encounter ended not with closure, not with proof, but with that terrible kind of certainty born from instinct and history. Jack left the ranch carrying no evidence in his hands, only the deepened conviction that Victor had once again poisoned everything he touched. When Jack returned to the Abbott house, the fury had not cooled. It had sharpened. Every step through the front door felt heavy with defeat, not because Victor had beaten him outright, but because Jack had looked into the face of the man he blamed and found nothing there except defiance. Nikki was there with Tracy when he came in, and the contrast between them was striking. Tracy's concern was immediate and deeply personal, the concern of a sister who knew Jack well enough to recognize the difference between anger and collapse. Nikki's presence carried its own complicated charge. She had spent so many years standing at the center of the battle lines between these families that she understood all too well what it meant when Jack came home looking like a man who had barely stopped himself from doing something. Irreversible. Jack's account of the confrontation came out in hard, bitter fragments. He complained about Victor with the intensity of someone who was tired of being dismissed, tired of being provoked, tired of having his life treated like an arena for someone else's power games. There was humiliation in his voice, but also helplessness, and that helplessness was what disturbed Tracy most. Jack was used to fighting. He was used to losing and winning. What he was not used to was the sense that the rules themselves had been corrupted beyond recognition. Nikki listened with the expression of a woman whose own loyalties had become too strained to defend with certainty anymore. There was a fatigue in her that had little to do with the day's events, and everything to do with years spent excusing, enduring, and rationalizing Victor's relentless need to dominate every situation and every person around him. Then came the confession that changed the tone in the room. Nikki admitted that she was no longer living at the ranch. The words landed with quiet force because they were not merely logistical, they were emotional, symbolic. A line had been crossed somewhere, and Nikki had finally reached the point where sharing a roof with Victor felt less like marriage and more like surrender. Her admission told Jack and Tracy more than she could have explained in a longer speech. It revealed that even Nikki, after a lifetime bound to Victor by love history, weakness, forgiveness, and habit, had been pushed to a point where distance had become necessary. The ranch once, the center of her life, now represented something harsher, an empire built on control, one that demanded too much from the people who loved its king. For Jack, Nikki's confession brought with it a twisted kind of validation. It did not lessen his pain, and it certainly did not solve anything with Diane, but it confirmed that he was not imagining the toxicity surrounding Victor. If Nikki herself could no longer remain there, then the sickness ran deeper than rivalry. It was structural, emotional, permanent, yet that validation also came with dread. Because if Victor could drive away Nikki, wound Jack, destabilize Diane, and still stand firm in his certainty, then there was no telling how much farther he would go. Tracy, always the emotional conscience of the family, understood that what frightened Jack most was not simply losing Diane's trust. It was the possibility that Victor had once again succeeded in turning love into collateral damage. While the Abbotts and Newmans circled old wounds in familiar mansions, another ache was unfolding elsewhere in a quieter, sadder form. At the park cafe, Daniel sat alone with memories that refused to soften. The world around him moved with ordinary ease, the clatter of cups, the muted hum of conversation, the casual rhythm of people living lives untouched by the private losses that could hollow a person out from the inside. In his hands was his phone, and on that screen lived a version of hope he could no longer keep. He found himself drifting backward into the romantic moments he had shared with Tessa, into those rare stretches of time when life had felt less complicated, less bruised by grief and misunderstanding. Their connection had not been simple, but it had been real enough to leave a mark. Looking at the photograph, Daniel did what people often do when they are not ready to move on but can no longer bear to stand still. He deleted it, not because the memory meant nothing, but because it meant too much. The gesture was small, almost invisible to the outside world, yet emotionally brutal. It was the kind of private surrender that carried more pain than any dramatic outburst. That moment at the cafe reflected a broader mood hanging over Genoa City, a sense that relationships were being forced into irreversible transitions. Nothing was staying in the safe, suspended place of uncertainty anymore. People were making choices. Cutting ties, pleading guilty, leaving homes, picking sides. And every one of those actions came with a cost. Daniel's decision to erase that photo was one more sign that sentiment alone could not protect anyone from the hard shape of reality. At Crimson Lights, the mood carried a different kind of emotional charge. Mariah sat with Sharon and Christine under the weight of a decision that had clearly not come easily. Her confession that Tessa had convinced her to accept the plea deal was not delivered with triumph or relief, but with the weary honesty of someone who had stopped fighting the inevitable. Tessa's influence in that decision mattered because it showed where Mariah was emotionally. She had not simply listened to legal advice. She had been guided by someone whose opinion reached the part of her that fear and pride had been battling over for too long. Tessa had apparently managed to do what neither panic nor stubbornness could accomplish, persuade Mariah to choose the path that might limit the damage rather than gamble everything on denial. Sharon's relief was immediate, and it came from a deeply maternal place. She knew how much Mariah had been carrying, how close anxiety and guilt could come to destroying a person before any judge ever handed down a formal decision. Christine, for her part, saw the plea deal through the lens of practicality and legal survival. She understood better than most how easily these situations could spiral when emotion overpowered strategy. Together, she and Sharon held on to the same hope that the judge would approve the agreement and spare Mariah the kind of prolonged uncertainty that could turn even a manageable consequence into an emotional catastrophe. Yet beneath that hope lingered the awareness that no legal resolution could fully undo what had already happened inside Mariah. Accepting a deal might protect her future in one sense, but it also required her to live with a label, a consequence, and a memory that would continue shaping how she saw herself. What made the scene at Crimson Lights so poignant was that it stood in contrast to the open warfare elsewhere. Here, the battle was inward. Mariah was not trying to destroy an enemy. She was trying to endure herself. And that kind of struggle can be even more merciless because there is no clear target for the anger, no easy place to direct the blame. Tessa's role in helping her accept the plea revealed something tender beneath the legal tension. Love, or at the very least, devotion, was still operating in quiet ways beneath the city's louder scandals. It was one of the few reminders that not every relationship in Genoa City had to be defined by manipulation. Sometimes, people still reached for one another to prevent a disaster rather than cause one. Even so, the emotional current linking all these separate stories was impossible to ignore. Jack wanted revenge because he believed something sacred had been violated. Diane was fighting not just Patty's taunts, but the creeping fear that trust might never fully return once doubt had entered a marriage. Nikki had walked away from the ranch, which meant even her legendary tolerance for Victor's darkness had found its breaking point. Daniel was deleting memories one tap at a time, trying to create distance from pain that still felt warm. Mariah was bracing herself for judgment, hoping that choosing accountability might somehow become the first step toward freedom. Everyone in one way or another was living inside the aftermath of decisions that could not be undone. Jack's rage toward Victor also began to take on a more dangerous dimension after Nikki's revelation. Until that point, part of his fury had been fueled by the belief that Victor was still safely insulated by the life he had built, still reigning over the ranch with the certainty that everyone eventually fell back into orbit around him. But Nikki's absence disrupted that image. It suggested cracks in Victor's fortress, emotional weaknesses that Jack had not expected to see so openly. That knowledge did not calm him. It emboldened him. Because once a Titan starts losing control at home, his reactions elsewhere often become more ruthless. Jack could sense that whatever came next would not remain contained to bitter words or wounded pride. Victor would not tolerate being confronted, doubted, or emotionally exposed, and a man like Victor, cornered by his own unraveling, was often at his most dangerous. At the same time, Nikki's choice to leave the ranch carried a sorrow that only someone like Tracy could truly appreciate. For all the history of betrayal, cruelty, and manipulation that defined Victor, Nikki had always represented the possibility that love could survive even the most damaged foundations. Her departure then felt like the quiet death of an illusion. It did not necessarily mean the marriage was over, but it meant something foundational had broken. Something she could no longer pretend to ignore. Tracy saw it as one more reminder that people often stay in painful situations far longer than they should not, because they are weak, but because history can be harder to leave than unhappiness. Nikki had not just left a house. She had stepped away from a version of herself that had spent years trying to manage Victor's darkness without being consumed by it. And in the background of it all lingered Diane, whose pain remained one of the most volatile elements in the entire situation. Jack could rage at Victor all he wanted, but his real fear was waiting at home in the form of one wounded woman's uncertainty. Diane did not need proof of a conspiracy to feel devastated. She only needed the image of Jack and Patty existing together in a way that violated everything Diane thought she had rebuilt. Patty's taunts had already done their damage. Victor's silence had deepened the suspicion. Jack's indignation, no matter how sincere, might still not be enough to mend the crack that had opened in the marriage. That was the cruelest part of all. Even if Jack was telling the truth, even if he had truly been drugged, even if Victor had engineered the whole nightmare, the emotional consequences would still fall hardest on the people who had not chosen any of it. By the end of the day, Genoa City felt less like a place of separate stories and more like a pressure chamber where every fragile relationship was being tested at once. Jack stood on the edge of vengeance. Nikki stood on the edge of reinvention. Diane stood on the edge of forgiveness or collapse. Daniel stood on the edge of letting go. Mariah stood on the edge of judgment, and whatever life might still be possible after it, no one had found peace. No one had found certainty. But all of them had moved one step closer to truths they could no longer avoid. And that is what makes this stretch of the story feel so powerful. It is not just about scandal, rivalry, or the usual dramatic collisions that define life in Genoa City. It is about what happens when private pain stops being containable, when every character is forced to confront the cost of loving the wrong person, trusting the wrong version of events, or waiting too long to walk away. Jack may believe his war is with Victor, but the deeper battle is for the soul of his own life, for the relationships that still matter before bitterness destroys them too. Nikki may have left the ranch, but leaving the emotional architecture of Victor Newman is far more difficult than packing a bag. Daniel may have deleted a photograph, but grief has never been erased so easily. Mariah may have accepted a plea, but acceptance is not the same as healing. In the middle of all this, the city keeps moving, its lights still glowing, its coffee still pouring, its clubs and mansions and cafes still standing as if nothing has changed. But everything has changed. Because once people stop pretending they can endure anything, the truth begins to surface, and truth in a place like this never arrives gently.